Thank you so much for coming. I'm thrilled to see so many people in the audience, including many of my students. My name is Julia Lee. I am a professor here in the English department, and I teach African American literature. It's an incredible pleasure to participate in the College of Liberal Arts Forum Lecture Series. So I would like to thank the Forum Lecture for helping to sponsor this visit by Dr. Murphy. I'd also like to thank the English department at UNLV, as well as the History department, the William S. Boyd College of Law, and the Sociology department for helping to co-sponsor this lecture. Dr. Murphy, Laura Murphy, and I go way back. She was one of my closest friends in graduate school, and I still remember taking my first post-colonial seminar with her. With Homie Baba was the professor, and we were terrified, and she was one of the only people in the classroom who was nice to me, so I appreciated that. In any case, she graduated in 2008 with a PhD from Harvard in African and African American Studies. She is an Africanist, that's her specialty. She studies historical slavery as well as modern slavery. She is also interested in global literatures and post-colonial studies, and in African literature broadly. She's the director of the Loyola Modern Slavery Research Project. She is the director of African and African American Studies as well, and she's an assistant professor at Loyola University in New Orleans. She's a native of New Orleans. She's published widely. Her first book, called Metaphor and the Slave Trade in West African Literature, which came out from Ohio University Press in 2012, and won the first book prize by the African Literature Association. This book looks at the way that West African writers have written or memorialized the trauma of the transatlantic slave trade. She also, this year, came out with a book, Survivors of Slavery, Modern-Day Slave Narratives. This came out of Columbia University. And this explores human trafficking through the first-person narratives of 40 survivors of modern-day slavery who have experienced enslavement in the last 20 years. And she's now working on a book called The New Slave Narrative, and this talk emerges from some of her work there and also from her work on the Survivors of Slavery collection of modern slave narratives. And some of you may recognize her. She appeared on the Melissa Harris Perry show a year ago to discuss the slave narrative tradition and 12 years a slave. I think she's phenomenal for being able to link her scholarly work with her political activism. I think she's unique or unusual in the Academy for being able to span the two. So I would like to welcome Dr. Laura Murphy. Let's give her a round of applause.
Hi everybody, I'm gonna go micless, but if you can't hear me in the back or something, just shout. I'm a teacher. I'm accustomed to being interrupted. So just feel free to just say, hey, I have no idea what that word means, or I need you to speak louder. I'm here, and your dog is talking. That's what I'm doing. He can bark. We're good. I'm going to talk today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what human trafficking is and modern slavery, how we define these things, because for some of you, this is going to be new material. And I'll tell you a little bit about how I got into this research. And then for those of you who are well-schooled in the definitions and the basics, there's good stuff for you too. I'm going to talk a little bit about my most recent research and the work I'm doing with the narratives that people have written or told about their lives in slavery today. And I'm going to link that a little bit to the historical slave narrative, because that's the work I'm working on now. So, okay, I'm going to try not to do that. I started an institute at my school called the Modern Slavery Research Project, and it is all about exactly what, I don't know what that is, but I'm going to try stuff. Okay. It's all about the kind of work that Julia was just talking about, linking the work we do in the academy to the real needs of people on the ground. And I think this is incredibly important work to do, and I think that the collaboration between people who are advocates and social workers and medical professionals and things like that to the work we're doing in the academy, they cannot be separated. We need to be having conversations together. We need to be producing things that are useful for people who are working to address major issues in the world, and that's what I want to do. This is a shameless plug for my first book. I want to go back and tell you how I got here and how I started doing this work, because I was working on a dissertation about the transatlantic slave trade, about the history of slavery, about Africa in the 19th century, and I was actually working on my comprehensive exams, which means I had a semester to read 200 books, and then I had an exam in which people were going to ask me any question they wanted about those 200 books in 2 hours, and I just had to be able to answer them all. And in the middle of the night, I was exhausted, I was tired of reading about slavery, because that's what most of my test was about, and I put aside these books, and I opened up my computer, and I started to read about modern slavery. And I think I'm getting ahead of myself, but let's see what the next slide is. Yeah, so what I was talking about in my work was how people claim that there's no story coming out of Africa about slavery, that people don't talk about slavery there. And the more I did research, the more I found that, in fact, there was a lot of memories of the slave trade, but there were special ways people talked about slavery. And through doing sort of narrative analysis, you could see the kinds of metaphors people used for captivity and for entrapment and for forced labor that were in African literature, but that people didn't notice, right? And so that's the kind of work I was doing for my dissertation. When, in the middle of the night, I got ahead of myself, when in the middle of the night, I was done reading and done thinking and thought I would take a break, and I opened up the New York Times magazine and found this article, The Girls Next Door, there. And I thought, oh, let me take a break, right? And I was just surfing the web, let me see. And I started reading, and I saw that this article starts with this house. There's a bust. Some police go to see what's going on in this house, and when they get there, they find 27 women packed into a single tiny apartment. And they describe it like this. They said the police found a squalid, land-based equivalent of a 19th century slave ship. The girls were pale, exhausted, and malnourished. And when I read that, my first response was revulsion. Absolute disgust that they could compare anything that's happening in the 21st century to a slave ship. My first thought was, how dare this person say that anything that exists right now could be anything like a slave ship? Clearly they have not read the things I've read. Clearly they do not know that Equiano describes his life in the hold of a slave ship in such graphic and horrific terms that it makes people's stomach turn. They must not know what they're talking about. So I kept reading, because the greatest impetus for reading for me is anger. And so I kept reading. And you know how New York Times Magazine articles are? They always go on too long. And if you read the first 3 pages and the last page, you can totally get by at a cocktail party. Like, oh yeah, that's right. Bonobo monkeys turn women on. Yes, that's right. I read all about the New York Times Magazine. So usually you read the first couple pages, you got it, and you move on. I could not stop reading this, even though the whole point of surfing the web at that time was to stop reading about slavery. And the more I read, the more I realized that what I was seeing was, in fact, what I was reading about was, in fact, people who were enslaved, people who were forced to work without pay, under threat of violence, without the means to escape. And it stopped me dead in my tracks. Because here I was, studying historical slavery, and people were being enslaved all around the world in all kinds of industries right here. And I became obsessed. And I thought, I was just saying this to someone a minute ago. I grew up in Louisiana. And there are plantations. You go on plantation tours as school field trips. Like, you have this park, day where everybody goes and plays in the park, and then you have the day everybody goes to see the plantation. And so, history of slavery was very much a part of my education. But when I heard about it in the 80s or whatever, I assumed that I would have been one of the good white people, right? I would have been an abolitionist. I would have maybe my parents would have owned slaves, but I would have been like, no, because I wasn't for any reason to fight my parents anyway, and clearly they would have been slaveholders. I I was like, no, I would have been one of the ones kicking down the doors. I would have been one of the ones changing the world. I would not have stood for that. It's outrageous. I can't believe this happened, right? From that distance of 150 years, I could easily say I would have been an abolitionist. But here I was, reading this article, thinking about historical slavery, and doing nothing about what was going on in the world right now. And it was a revelation to me. I had never been a tree hugger. I'd never saved a whale. I'd never even really been concerned about exploitative labor, actually. I didn't protest sweatshops when I was in college. I hadn't been an activist. This changed my life. It stopped me dead in my tracks, and I completely shifted what I did. I was a good little girl, so I continued doing my dissertation, and, I published the book, and I did the things that you're supposed to do. But all the while, I'm sure you're not putting my video on YouTube.
No, this no, this is for another student.
Okay, that's cool. Just say this. But everything changed, and yeah, I got distracted. Sorry. And so I wanted to make sure that I did something about this, and so I started working with organizations. Worked with a bunch of different organizations, good and bad, saw things that worked, saw things that that didn't, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that today. So what is it that we're talking about? What did we all come here to think about tonight? The legal term for what we're talking about tonight is human trafficking. So the legal definition of trafficking is not the movement of people across borders, as a lot of people think. The legal definition of trafficking is when someone is compelled to work through force, fraud, or coercion. Or in the case of sex work, any person who's under the age of 18, even without force, fraud, or coercion. But over the age of 18, force, fraud, or coercion to compel labor, right? And so recently, and before Obama, but we like Obama, so we refer to him. Obama said a couple years ago, we need to call this by its rightful name. We need to call it slavery. Now, why would he use such an important word? Why would he use a word that has so much gravity and that means so much to so many people? He uses this word because it is the word that describes the thing we're seeing, right? Conservative estimates say that 30 million people are enslaved in the world today. And when we talk about those people, it's the definition that I just gave you. People who are forced to work under threat of violence without the means to escape amidst something, without pay. People who are forced to work. And that is the definition of slavery. And we see this in all kinds of industries around the world today. We see it in sex work. A lot of people, when they talk about slavery or human trafficking, they focus on sex work. Now, for every one person who's enslaved in the sex industry today, there are 8 people enslaved in other forms of labor. And so we get a very narrow vision of what slavery is because sex sells. That's what's on TV. Teen sex slaves in the suburbs is something that you can show on MSNBC. Most people won't watch sad strawberry pickers, who are being forced to work under bad conditions. People don't watch that movie, but they do watch, Taken or whatever. So, but what is held in common between all these folks who are, some of them are hair braiders, and some of them are boys choir singers, and some of them are agricultural laborers, that what they have in common is that they're being forced to work without pay, under threat of violence, without the means to escape. They are enslaved. And there are many, some of them manage to run away, some of them never do. Some of them tell their story, some of them will never hear. But I became invested in trying to understand the stories that people tell about that experience. And so much of it was reminiscent of the transatlantic slave trade. For me, as an Africanist, as somebody who's studying the transatlantic slave trade, these kinds of maps completely obsessed me, because we have maps like this of the transatlantic slave trade, movements of people across borders, where were people moving when, and I started thinking about, you'll knock me me off with a stick or something if I become electrocuted, right? You know how that works, right? Don't touch me, grab a piece of wood, right? Okay. Okay. Nobody has to go down with me. But and I started thinking about how this is going on in Africa. I started working with some groups in Africa, and I started pondering, like, what is going on here? And I'm an English professor. I'm not a sociologist. I don't have any skills. I can't. I don't know how to use SIS. I don't know SPSS. SIS is our school. SPSS. I don't know anything about statistics, right? But I started thinking, like, what from the work I do can help me understand what's going on? And it occurred to me, and it sort of, like, I just started to think about the slave narrative. I started to think about Frederick Douglass and how he went on a lecture circuit and told his story to people about having been enslaved in the 19th century, and how that was one of the biggest, things that impacted people's ability to see that slavery had to end, was hearing the voices of people who had been enslaved, hearing their stories, and understanding explicitly what had been going on, what was in fact going on in the South. Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Linda Brent, all these people went out on, William Wells Brown, went out on lecture circuits and told their stories. And as I started working in the movement to end slavery, I started meeting survivors who were doing the same thing. They were the Frederick Douglasses of our day. They're out there putting their lives on the line, telling their stories, often being very traumatized by even telling their stories, going out there and risking everything to tell people about this because they wanted to make sure it didn't happen to anybody else. And it occurred to me that not only did slavery exist, but the slave narrative still existed. That there were narratives being shaped, and there were certain narrative structures, certain generic tendencies. English majors like genre, thinking about what are the conventions of the genre. So I started thinking about this. That's what I was doing. We got some English majors in here, nerdy. Yeah. And so I started to trace that trajectory. How did this happen? What do the slave narratives look like? And the first one I can find, and I'm not sure I'm right, and I welcome extra, if you know of one that comes before this, I'd love to hear about it. But the first narrative that I've been able to locate that utilizes the idea of slavery to tell the story of captivity or forced labor after the WPA narratives of the 1930s, which was the last narratives told by people who had been enslaved in the antebellum period. They were like 100 years old. They all think they're 105 years old in those narratives. But the WPA narratives were collected in the 1930s of the last living survivors of slavery in the United States from the antebellum period. The first narrative that evokes that idea of slavery again and really tries to create a slave narrative of a story of captivity. This doesn't mean that nobody was forced to work between 1930 and 1981. This doesn't mean that nobody had been held in captivity and not paid, or that happened. But the first person to really consciously evoke slavery to describe that situation was a woman named Zana Hussein. And she wrote a book about being a child bride in Yemen. And the book it has its detractors. She tried to get her sister out. Her sister was also a child bride in Yemen. She tried to get her sister out, and her sister was like, I'm not held captive. I'm totally fine with this. And then she sent some mercenaries in to try to kidnap her sister from the family she was living with. There's a lot of sketchy stuff around this book. But it is the first book that I can find that says, Boots sold a woman's true account of modern slavery, right? That starts to really evoke that. And this happens in 1991. I said 81. It was 1991. After that book came out, there wasn't a lot of attention to that. There was a growing interest in slavery around the world. People were starting to think about it. But this book, Rested, that comes out in 1997, written by Jean-Robert Cadet, about his life as a child laborer in Haiti. He was forced to work for a woman who was like a family friend of his biological father, who was a white man, and didn't want to have anything to do with him, dropped him off, and he was a slave. He was enslaved to a woman who was supposed to treat him as a mother, but in fact forced him to work. And there are, I don't know, does anybody know the numbers on how many Restovacs there are? It's like 300,000 Restovac children in Haiti. But there are a lot of kids who are forced to work in Haiti. And he came out and said, we need to stop this, and told his story as an act of activism. That's one of the main impetuses of writing a slave narrative, right? You don't just write that because you just felt like tearing yourself to pieces telling your story, right? They write because their goal is to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. And that's exactly what Jean-Robert Cadet did. He started his own foundation, and he works to end restodex slavery in Haiti. And he, again, evokes the idea of slavery in his title. Within his book, he talks about Toussaint Louverture. He talks about other people who were enslaved. He evokes that. Like, this is not me saying, oh, this is a slave narrative just out of the blue. These are folks who are intentionally using the slave narrative as a touch point to try to describe something that's happening to them in the 20th and 21st century. And so soon after this book came out, several others came out, including two, this one by Francis Bach and another by Mende Nazar. You may have run across these books that describe the lives of these two people who had been enslaved in Sudan. During the Civil War, they had been captured and then forced to work for families. He worked as I guess the word is shepherd, I was going to say sheep herder, like an animal tender, and she worked as a domestic servant. And they told their stories, both of them, again, evoking this idea of slavery to describe their lives and touching on Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown as touch points for understanding how to read their lives. This is the rebirth, I argue. This is the rebirth of the slave. And so after that, I would say that there's not a year that goes by after these guys published in 2003 where there isn't at least one new slave narrative that comes out. And usually there's more. And this year there are many more. It's becoming a way for survivors to launch activist careers, to launch nonprofits, to get the word out about their experience and about the experiences of 30 million other people in the world who are living through this and trying to fight that, right? And this is just a bunch of pictures of people who are telling their stories today, many of whom are probably, if I did this right, shameless plug for my book, many of them have told their stories in survivors of slavery, which, by the way, brackets is for sale after the event. So all proceeds go to organizations that help survivors, by the way. I don't get any money from this. I don't want any money from this. So they tell their stories now, and what I want to do is talk about three things. Three questions that are constantly churning in my head about this new slave narrative tradition or this reemergence of the slave narrative tradition that I'm describing here. One, how does it work? Because I'm an English nerd and I want to know how the things are structured. How do people tell slavery? And I don't think that this is useful only for English nerds. It's useful for people who are psychologists, it's useful for people who are social workers, who are talking to people and are thinking about, well, you know, there are gaps in their story, or this person's telling me this, but I don't understand really what they're talking about. Thinking about narrative is important to everyone who comes into contact with someone who's been traumatized. And so, so I want to think about how it works. How do these narratives work? How does this genre work? Two, why now? Why would this happen all of a sudden in the 90s that people start, and especially the 90s and the early 2000s, that people start thinking about this so hard? And what can it teach us? What can we take away from it as citizens, as people who might interact with people who are survivors, as people who might actually be advocates for them? So one, how does it work? When you read slave narratives of the 19th century, slave narratives will often stop and say something like, I can tell you about slavery, I can tell you about slave masters, but you can never know what it means to be enslaved, right? William Wells Brown has this haunting passage where he says, I can tell you about slavery as it is, but you will never know the real depth of pain. I will never be able to communicate to you what it really means to be enslaved. And one of the things that struck me most when I first started reading slave narratives that are written in the 21st century is that people are confronting that same inability to actually communicate the depth of trauma, the depth of suffering and horror that happens when you are forced to work without pay or threat of violence with no means to escape. And you can see this is James Kopianen. He was enslaved in the fishing industry as a child in Ghana. And he was beaten, he was sexually assaulted, he saw things that are horrific, and he comes to the same point where he says, one of my greatest challenges is to try to help you understand what that experience could possibly be like. You in your comfy library chair, or you're sitting here in this nice audience, you can go back home to the safety of your life, and maybe you have a crappy job, but you can leave, right? How do I describe that to you? How do I tell that story? Because nothing I put on paper will capture what happened. Every time, and he's writing his autobiography right now, he's trying to write a book-length autobiography, and he not only wants to capture the experience, he also wants it to have some joking moments and have some light moments. And he's like, how could I possibly express that I was also still sometimes joking with my friends? How do I express the fear I had? And so often narratives have this gap, this silence that cannot be bridged. And you think, okay, this is going to be just this horrific story of trauma. But often, at the moment when you think the most traumatic thing's about to happen, someone's about to be sexually assaulted, right? Someone's about to be raped. Somebody's about to be beaten by their employer, right? Their slaveholder. Something horrific's about to happen. I have noticed, I argue, that people who are telling the stories of slavery today, and actually in the 19th century too, use strategies of displacement to avoid talking about that moment. So, what happens? What do? How do you not talk about the very act of violence that defines the experience you are trying to get people to work against, right? To fight against. So how do you do that? How do they do it? There's often these silences. So one of the things I've noticed is that people turn to external authority to validate their narrative. If you've ever read a 19th century slave narrative, you know that it always starts with some white minister who says, I guarantee that what you will find in this book is absolutely real and true, right? And so maybe William Lloyd Garrison tells a little bit about how he knows Frederick Douglass and explains it. Maybe there's a poet that talks about the horrors of slavery. Maybe there's a minister who tells, verifies, validates the experience of the person who's writing, the person who's enslaved. I call this paratextual authority, things that are around the book. They're not within the book. They're sort of the apparatus around the book, the cover, the preface, the appendices. This is really widely used still today, even though we recognize that Frederick Douglass needed no one to validate his story. Publishers maybe are not so quick on the uptake. And so what happens is often you'll find things like this. You'll find a quote by Hillary Clinton saying that this young woman is one of the greatest women I've ever seen. She sets an example with her courage. Nicholas Kristof will maybe say, I've seen the horrors of what happened to young so-and-so. I verify that this is really happening and it's real. So some people will allow that voice to validate who they are and will refer to that as a sign that, look, a psychiatrist has guaranteed that what I did, what happened to me really did happen. And you can find that in the appendices, right? But there are other ways people do this. Sometimes people will, so I'm thinking particularly right now of Rachel Lloyd in Girls Like Us. She's telling her story, and she starts to describe a moment when her pimp is about to beat her. And when she gets to the point where we're really about to see the violence, where she's about to recount that horrific experience, she suddenly has a paragraph break, one of those kind of bigger paragraph breaks. I don't know what you call that. But there's a double paragraph break, and then she starts talking about the American perception of pimps. People think pimps are, they wear flashy clothes. People think pimps are whatever. And she just stops, and she moves away, and she starts talking about statistical evidence of what's going on in pimp culture. She starts talking about, 97% of Americans, surveyed said blank. She'll stop and she'll talk about, if she's talking about her own experience of being abused as a child, she'll stop and she'll start talking about UNICEF statistics on child abuse. She pulls away from that moment of abuse and shows you something else. The same thing happens in a lot of narratives with what I'm calling projection, with like people stopping the narrative in the middle and saying, oh, I was just about to be beaten. I met this young boy, Sam, one day, and then described similar things happening to Sam instead of to themselves. Now, there are a lot of explanations for why this happens. There's also, and I don't have a slide for this, but people also turn to metaphor. They'll often say things like, so one woman was abducted and enslaved by the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. And instead of saying that she had been raped or been put into a forced marriage, she said she was distributed to a commander. And that's about all she says about the fact that she was forced to sleep with this man for months while she was also forced to be a soldier on the battleground, right? A lot of people turn to metaphorical ways of describing what happened to them. And part of that has to do with trauma. Part of that has to do with the difficulty of assimilating such incredibly traumatic things into your life narrative, being able to tell that part of your story explicitly. So part of it is about repression, right? But I argue also that part of it is about empowerment. People's bodies were the site of their enslavement. They were forced to work, or they were forced to have sex. And they were forced to expose themselves to people in ways that were against their will, that were horrific and terrible. And when they have the power to tell their own stories, they cloak themselves, right? They say, you cannot look at this. This is not for you. I will tell you what happened, but I'm going to defer sometimes to other ways of telling this story because I don't want to give you everything, right? I don't want to reveal all that's happened to me. And part of that has to do with the way we ourselves sort of tabooize, what's the word I'm looking for here? Marginalize people who have had these kinds of experiences. And so they want to hide it. They don't want to be exposed in that way. But also, I think it empowers people to be able to say, this is my story. I will tell what I want to tell. Shamir McKenzie spoke to my class a couple of weeks ago. She's a survivor of sex trafficking here in the United States. And she was speaking via Skype, and it was hard to get along. And she was it was hard to get students to ask questions because it was kind of a strange environment. And she said, look, you can ask me anything you want, and I will tell you whatever it is I want to tell you, right? I'm not going to tell you anything I don't want to tell you. Ask away. Don't be afraid. But I might say, that question's not happening. I'm not doing that, right? And so that power, regaining the power of their own narrative is part of the process of writing the narrative. And I find this really fascinating. And I think it's incredibly important, for instance, for law enforcement to know this. They're not going to just come up to you and say, hey, this is what happened to me, or here's what rape was like, or right, this is what it was like to be abused by my employer in the strawberry field. This is what it was like to see somebody get killed at work, right? People don't want to just talk about their most traumatic experiences that quickly, and maybe not even ever at all. And so recognizing those strategies of displacement is one way to make sure that identifying victims is possible, right? And not just saying, oh, well, they wouldn't tell me anything, so we'll just send them back, which is what's happening today a lot of times. So why do people start telling their stories at all? Why would the 2000s see such a surge in people coming out and saying, wait, this happened to me? And I'm thinking about this a lot. I welcome suggestions for other hypotheses. But I think there are several different things that have made this happen. One is that people like Kevin Bales, who wrote a book called Disposable People, started saying the word slavery in association with forced labor. So there was a sort of reinvigorated use of that word in the academy and also in nonprofits, and people started saying we need to be thinking about slavery that is happening in our midst. So that word provided language for an experience people have been having, but that we had sort of said, well, in the United States, slavery ended in 1865, so you can't use that word. Right? That word is not open to other experiences. And if it's not legally endorsed, then it's not slavery. That's outrageous. If somebody was in the bayous of Louisiana, and Emancipation Day happens. Now, oh boy, everybody, slavery is over in the United States. But this dude didn't find out and remained enslaved for 8 years. Just because there's not a legal institution of slavery doesn't mean that that man's not enslaved. He is enslaved. And that has happened all over the world since then. There have been people, colonial governments, forced people into labor camps, right? There are all kinds of forced labor that's been going on since 1865 all over the world and long before slavery existed on these shores. And so what this work did, what the nonprofits and what the academic work did, was say, look, this is slavery. This is what's going on. And so people started understanding that term as something that describes the forced labor they were experiencing. And there becomes, as a result of that, there becomes a much invigorated nonprofit movement to stop forced labor. And so tons of organizations pop up in the 90s especially in the wake of major cases where we see people who are immigrant laborers here in the United States, being locked up at night, forced to work, not being paid, being held in debt bondage. Some big cases came up in the 90s in which that happened, and nonprofit groups sprung up to fight those situations. Often they were immigrant groups, refugee groups, and they then suddenly realized, wait, what we're seeing among a ton of immigrant laborers is this problem of enslavement, that people are actually being held against their will and forced to work and not being paid. Now, in order to prosecute those cases, we have to have people who will testify. We have to have people who come to the bench and tell their stories. And so these stories started to be circulated. They were part of the congressional record. Nonprofits started using stories to promote their causes, and people who had themselves been enslaved started to see that people were telling their stories and then started responding by telling their own. There's also in the 90s and early 2000s a huge memoir boom. Everybody wants to tell about their lives, right? Oh, my daddy kissed me, or oh, I had a hard life, living on an Oklahoma farm, or I had a completely boring and average middle-class white New York male life, and I'm going to tell you all about it anyway. And so, it's so true, that's why you laugh. The 90s saw a huge boom in first-person narration, and also in like the kind of Oprah's and Maury Povich's and those kinds of shows where people were supposed to get on stage and tell about the worst thing that ever happened to them, right? And so we've kind of grown in the 90s and the early 2000s into a confessional culture where people tell, and you see this now with Facebook, people want to tell you like that they did their laundry. You don't have to tell me everything. Some stuff is boring. I don't care. I told people out here to tell me about their laundry. And so we're talking about their laundry. They're not telling me. But we are a confessional culture. And so people tell their stories. And there's a lot of avenues, places, venues for telling your story now too, especially if that story involves trauma. And so that, I think, increased the likelihood that people will come out and tell their stories. And also part of what I want to argue is that in the post 9/11 decades now, the post 9/11 years, there grew up, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, there grew up a real anxiety about immigration and about Islam that made it so that nonprofit groups sought out survivors to tell stories that involved, including Mende Nasser and Francis Buck, that involved nefarious Islamic predators. And so that also made people more engaged and encouraged people to use human trafficking as sort of a guise for anti-Islamic activism. And you can see, for instance, with the cover of this book, Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam. This book that you may have even received a meme from this book. I get emails every now and then that have excerpts from this guy's book. It is the least scholarly book you could possibly imagine, posing as a scholarly book, and it's just like Islam is the source of all slavery in the world. Christians have done nothing but eradicate and emancipate. It's a ridiculous, and people buy it. People send it to me, they're like, do you think this is true? And I'm like, did you read it? No, it's not true. And this book, for instance, uses Mende Nazari's book as evidence that it's happening, that Islamists are responsible for it. She, by the way, was herself Muslim, and she does not at all talk about Islam as a source of the problem she had, but they take up that book in that way. And this happens many times. And this is about what can we learn? This is one of the things we can learn. I could spend all night talking to you about what we can learn about these things, or from the people who tell their stories about slavery. But one of the things I want us to take away today is this problem with using survivors as puppets for our own political causes. So this is an example of it. This book, Girl Soldier, sold a lot of books in Christian bookstores, in part because the book was all about how Islam was going to, had enslaved this woman, and will likely come to enslave you. And this is how the narratives get taken up. So she, Grace Akala, was actually forced into servitude in the LRA. Horrific things happened to her. She was a forced bride. She was also a forced soldier. She gets about, this narrative, this book is about 250 pages. It's supposed to be a first-person narrative. It's sold as her true first-person story. She has about 60 pages in the book. The other 200 pages are written by a woman named Faith McDonald, who tells a story that's almost exclusively about the terrors of Islam. And Grace's story says nothing. It's almost silent about Islam. She goes into Sudan for one moment, and she uses Arabs and Islamists interchangeably for like 2 sentences. But otherwise, she talks not at all about Islam. But Faith McDonald's story is entirely about the Islamic menace, right? And what I want to say is that this is not unusual. In fact, and she completely exoticizes Africa. Just read this. She exoticizes Africa. She makes the entire place seem to be like a place that's endemically ruined, endemically haunted. And she entirely blames it on Islam. She also completely exonerates Christian missionaries for their role in slavery. She completely exonerates the colonial project. Everything is about Islam. And I think that her story is a warning to us, right? I think that her story is a warning to us that we can take from Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass worked with a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who's one of the most prominent and incredibly powerful and, in fact, incredibly generous people ever known to mankind, right? He really was a true abolitionist. He worked his entire life. He gave everything. He didn't need to, but he gave everything to fighting the cause, fighting against slavery. He worked with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass would go out on lecture circuits with him, and he would tell his story and use it to empower people to end slavery. But there was a point where Frederick Douglass said, "Look, Garrison, look, Billy, I don't know what you look like. Look, Garrison, we don't see eye to eye on this constitutional issue." They had some differences on what the Constitution could do to end slavery. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to talk about the Constitution and what I think. And Garrison says, "Oh, no, you're not. Look, you be the experience, and I'll be the philosophy." That's what Frederick Douglass says that Garrison says. Garrison is a person I respect and admire a great deal. But there's a point in their relationship where Douglass said, "You have to let me philosophize, politicize myself. I have this experience. I have some things to say." And Garrison silenced him and said, "No, you can't say those things. They're not part of the message I'm trying to get across." And Frederick Douglass left him. He split ways. He joined a group of radical abolitionists who had a different agenda. One of them was John Brown. on 5. But he broke from Garrison, because Garrison wanted Douglas to be his puppet. Garrison expected that he would be, that Garrison was the story, not the meaning, not the politics. That Garrison was an example, that Douglas was the example of what Garrison was fighting for. And so I think we need to be very circumspect. I don't know what the next slide is. I think we need to be very circumspect about what survivor voices do. People will often say things like, well, you're a voice for the voiceless. I'm not a voice for the voiceless. The people I work with have voices, and many of them are very loud and very commanding. There are many people who don't have a platform like I do, like this. They don't get invited to come stand up here and talk to you. I consider myself a megaphone. Their stories I share with you. I talk to them and ask, what do you need to have happen next? Those are the kinds of things we need to do if we're going to be involved in supporting some cause. It's not our own, right? We can't be Garrison. We can't say, oh, we're gonna have survivors as puppets, or we're gonna wear the mask of slavery in this way. We have to be able to see how we can let survivor voices be projected into the world without shaping them and making them suit our own agendas, right? If Grace Akalo is adamantly opposed to Islam, well, maybe, okay, but she's not. That's not her platform. That's not her position. That's a position that she's being puppeted to tell. And her face on the cover of the book, her story, although that's not really her face on the book, but you get what I'm saying, is what's selling the agenda of someone else. So I think we need to be circumspect. And so when these are my students, when a group of people like you get together and say, wait, well, so what should I do? Because that's what happens. That's what should happen after you hear me talk about this stuff. You should say, what should I do? The main thing, I don't know what the next slide is, let's see. The main thing I want us to do, it's the right one, is to think about how we can have a survivor-centered approach to this issue. How we can listen to the people who've had these experiences and figure out what they say we need and shape our agendas from them. Let them shape the agenda. Let them shape the narrative. Because there's some things they don't want to tell. There's some things they want to keep closed. There's some things that we don't need to tell. We don't need a sensationalized story. We don't need a Liam Neeson to save one little white girl out of all those people in that rock. Right? We need to be listening to what's going on and doing what we can, taking the skills that we have, whether it's English skills, I can write like a mad woman, right? I can write. You might be able to write songs. You might be able to do web design. You need to hear what they need and use your platform, use your skills and your privilege to do the work that they ask of us. And so that is the lesson, I think. That's one of the many lessons I think this paying attention to these narratives can teach us. And that's the end of my story.
So we do have some time for questions. I'm sure a lot of you have questions. And then I'll let you choose one. And there are copies of Dr. Murphy's book available.
Not so many, but it's also available on Amazon. Woman, you had your hand up, boom! So I'm ready to hear your question.
Did survivors like Grace Akalo ever come out and say things about how their stories were sort of bastardized?
So Grace Akalo, no. Other people, yes. So one of the things that's happening right now in the movement are people like Rachel Lloyd and this woman Holly Austin-Smith and some other folks who've come out and said, look, every time I talk to the media, you totally reshape what I said. And every time I go out and give a talk, so when survivors stand where I'm standing, people ask them atrocious questions. Like, oh, I noticed that you didn't really talk about your pimp. Could you describe him in great detail and tell us what exactly he did to keep you there? Or why didn't you leave? shouldn't you have just run away? Why didn't you turn to the police? Like, they get asked these questions, and like that are like really directed at the things that they're holding inside, holding to themselves, and they're expected to then just reveal all right there in front of everybody, in front of an audience of strangers, right? And so they're all, and they also are being utilized for nonprofit agencies, and then they realize, wait, that wasn't my message. That's not the thing I wanted to get across. That's not the thing I think you can learn from my experience. And so they've been coming out, writing articles, mainly newspaper articles, saying, you need to hear what I actually say, right? You need to not publish, bastardized versions of what I say. And so there are some people who are starting to speak out and fight back on this, and it's not like every narrative is like this. It's not as if, every single person who's speaking has someone pulling strings. I do not want by any means to suggest that. But I think we have to be circumspect, and they are calling for us to be much more circumspect, and especially calling for the media to be more careful with what they say. I've even had someone say, well, isn't New Orleans a hub for human trafficking? And I'll say things like, while some people might say New Orleans is a hub for human trafficking, semicolon, in fact, comma, something else. And then, when they edit my story, I have said New Orleans is a hub for human trafficking, and they put that in, even though all the apparatus of that sentence said something else. And so this is part of what's happening, and they're trying to take back the mic. And so yeah, there are some people who are coming out and saying quit it, but it's not. Grace Apollo runs her own organization and is not really dealing with this book anymore that much. So yes.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I designed a book, actually in the library 2 years ago, Wind in the Jar. We're talking about how it's kind of difficult for people to relate to those saying, hey, I had a slavery experience, right, in this day and age. In that book, this anthropologist talking about anthropology sharing a story about this guy who went to study headhunters. And when I went 9 months, I had him sit down with him and say, this is why I take somebody's head. Because my brother, 3 years ago, had his head chopped off, and I needed a place to put that pain.
Yeah.
So then the next 20 years, this guy goes all over the world, tells everybody, tells the story 1,000 times. This is what headhunting is all about, right? Books about everything. Goes back to the same country, I think, when it's talking again, and his wife falls off on his cliff. Watches her fall to her death, 3,000 people, instead of hiking. And it's only in that moment he realizes he never really knew what it feels like to lose someone you love that much.
Yeah.
And he spent 20 years writing books and telling people about it, and everybody read his book.
Right.
Talking about, what it means to be this. So here's the thing, who doesn't want freedom more than anything?
Right.
Maybe that's what we all want as a goal. How do you get people to care?
Mm-hmm.
How do you get people to embrace that pain in a world where, just 90% of what we hear on the news or more is pain.
Yeah.
People want to shut it off, and no one wants it to happen to their, family or friends or whoever. It's going on all the time, has been for eternity, and we say we're past it, and people want to believe that. How do we get people to care without shutting down, so that not just real dialogue happens with scholarly folks, with politicians that want to make it sound like it too, but the people that really get that, hey, humanity can rise above this.
Yeah.
And how does that happen in a society where we're in we think we know what it's like because we hear a blurb,
Right.
but it doesn't translate.
Right.
It's often.
Yeah, this is something we think about really often when, I think probably with any social movement, thinking about how do we get people engaged. And one of the routes people take is to just radically sensationalize, right? So you'll see, if you search Google Images for human trafficking, you'll see packages of women. In fact, I used to have a slide in this one. Packages of women packaged like meat, women caught in jars, girls chained to beds. You see all these kind of disgusting, sensational things. And I submit to you, and I could be wrong, that actually disengages people. That these kind of radical, super sensationalize things, make people feel helpless. Makes them feel like, oh, that it's just, oh, some salacious, terrible thing is happening out there. It's happening to somebody else. It's gross. Like, turn away. I really, genuinely, maybe it's just where I come from, I believe that it's really important that we just tell people straight up what's actually happening. No sensationalized statistics that are totally misconstrued. Just the straight up what's going down. And utilizing these narratives of people who are telling it from their own experience, or having a survivor stand up here. Typically, I'll have a survivor with me, like say their own story, right? Because you don't need me. Once you hear someone talk about that experience, typically people are very much like, okay, this can't happen. But I don't think any of you actually need to be standing next to another human. I trust other humans enough to believe that you don't need to be standing next to someone and say, this happened to you and I can see your face, to be convinced that we cannot live in a world in which people are enslaved. That we have a responsibility to change a world that is so willing to make a buck that they will take away a person's life's labor for nothing. That we can't live in a world like that. We can't abide by that. And that I am reaffirmed in that, because every time I give a talk like that, 15 students come up and say, I want to start working on this, or I want to do something, or I've been doing something about this. I think that just the facts really do a lot to tell people this is what's going on. It's incredibly sobering and real, and there are things you can do. Kevin Bale says we can end slavery in 25 years. I love that guy, but like, I don't know, 25 years? In fact, it's been a few years since he said it. I feel like the clock is ticking, and it makes me nervous, like, how are we gonna catch up? But I think that there, one of the things he says that I think is really convincing is that we have everything in our favor. There's no country in which slavery is legal. Laws are against it, right? Every country is set in that way. He also says there's no economy that is solely bound by slavery, right? In the 19th century, it was incredibly hard to end slavery because the economy was going to collapse, and it did. Come to Louisiana. We are still suffering from the collapse of our economy. Now, it's better than having slavery, but we are still suffering from that. We're still suffering from the inequality of that system all over the United States, all over the world. But the fact that no economy will collapse means that we can get people behind it, means that we can get governments behind it, means that we can actually stop it. It has to do with ending corruption, police corruption. It has to do with, I hate to say it, it has to do with making sure that people who are poor have enough to eat, that people have money in their pockets, that nobody is living on $1.50 a day. We have to change that. There are systemic changes that have to happen, but they can happen. There's enough resources in the world for everyone to eat every single day on this planet. And we pretend like it's not true. Pretend like we're in a scarcity situation, but there's enough for every single person to eat every single day. And when we start to rethink that, I think when we alleviate poverty, we'll be fine. No, and that's what it sounds like. It sounds Pollyannish, but I think that we are making those kinds of shifts, and I think addressing slavery is integral to making that happen. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think there's like an element of fear that people have because it's kind of like, because we see movies and media kind of just exploit slavery and stuff, like the movie Taken, that it's this big scary situation, and because slavery is not legal anywhere, it's kind of like everything's done underground, everything's in secret. Obviously, it's a huge problem, so it's extremely organized, and slave laborers are wanting to keep it going on. So I guess it's kind of like, before seeing this presentation, I had always had the impression, which I admit is ignorant, is like, I do feel helpless, like, what can I do? I'm not some burly man that can go in there and kick everyone's butt, and save all these people that are being, going through the human trafficking and stuff. So I guess, like, how would you address the fear factor of, like, I can't do that, I don't know what to do, it's kind of like, I'm someone that I want justice to happen, I want to get them out of that situation, and I feel like I can't, I'm not capable of doing that.
So if you think about the civil rights movement, for instance, you think about Rosa Parks, you think about Martin Luther King. Those people did not do that alone. There were huge organizational
organizational structures that made them possible, right? They were leaders, they were figureheads, they were people whose faces were the face of the movement. They were able to speak to government, Martin Luther King able to speak to government, but there was a massive apparatus, people who were editing his speeches, people who were checking his website, writing his Twitter, like getting him appointments, making sure, everything happened in place. There's huge networks that put Rosa Parks on that bus and actually took other women off the bus, like vetted who was going to be Rosa Parks. And I think that we all kind of want to be a hero. We kind of want to be the one kicking down the door, throwing kids over our shoulders and running out like, yeah, they're free now, right? And that's how we imagine this going down. But I work in Ghana, for instance, with James Kopiana. And, he goes on a boat to remote fishing villages on Lake Volta, and he goes in and he negotiates with fishermen, saying, look, you don't have to use enslaved labor. You don't have to use child labor. Let me teach you some new methods. Let me talk this through. You let me take these kids back and take care of them, bring them back to their parents. And I, in turn, will teach you other fishing methods, right? He doesn't kick down doors. He has the police ready in case something goes down. And when he does finally go to say, that's it, we're taking these kids, whether you like it or not. Okay, you don't want to negotiate, you don't want to learn new fishing methods, you want to be a jerk. Great, we're taking these kids. He has the police back with him, but he doesn't have a crazy white lady on the boat, right? I can't be there. People would be for miles, where's that white lady going, right? They would know. I would completely ruin the operation. The only reason I would be there is for me, to make me feel good, so I could feel like a hero, because I would actually wreck the thing. So what do we do then if we want to actually make change in the world? Because we do. I believe that about you. And it doesn't matter what your cause is. Maybe your cause is now or always has been human trafficking. Maybe your cause is, I don't know what else. All the other things, the horrible things that are going on in the world, poverty and immigration and all this stuff. Maybe that's your cause. Whatever it is your cause. You don't have to be the face of that movement. You might be. You're all very good looking. But you don't have to be the face of that movement. You don't have to be the person who's standing right there. You don't have to be the person kicking down the door. You might be the person who edits the website. And today, you don't have a cause if you don't have a website. You don't exist, right? You may be the person who helps write speeches. You may be the person who helps write grants. Right? I write grants for James. I go to school and help make sure that his handbook for his school is in line with the requirements of the granting operations that give him money to keep the school open. It is kind of boring. It is. There's no adrenaline rush when I say, yes, I finished your handbook. Right? There's nothing. But it's absolutely imperative that he does this if he's going to keep doing his work, if he's going to keep getting funding. And I am happy to be in the background, typing up little handbooks or, doing whatever it is he needs to make that happen. A lot of the folks that I talked about, they wanted to have a more public profile. And they had given a talk or two here or there, but they had no web presence. They had no business cards. And I was like, I can make you a website. It's easy. It took me a week. I made a website for 7 people, and now they have a place where they can say, if you'd like to learn more about what I do, go to survivorsofslavery.org, right? Here's my business cards, this is Survivors of Slavery. They got a brand. I know that that's how the world works. And they were like, I need to get in on that, but I have other things to do. I got to raise my kids. I got to go to school. I have to make a buck. I have a week. Let's do it. And so part of it is about saying, I don't have to be the savior, right? And I also don't have to free all 30 million at one time, right? That's not what's going down. There's a lot of work to be done. And your skills are valuable in that work, right? Let's see.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'm admittedly an English narrative geek.
Yeah.
Like you, and I'm really interested in that component of it. So are these narratives written, I know a lot of early slave narratives were written for money. Are these also written for money?
If they were written for money, it would be a sad message. Nobody's making a ton of cash off of this. Publishing books doesn't make a lot of money. Most of them are self-published. So they're not actually, you know, with big presses. Rachel Lloyd's book has done pretty well, and is with a big press. I'm trying to think if it's Macmillan, I think. But is it Random House? She has a pretty big press. But most of the folks who are telling their stories don't have that kind of distribution. But one of the things I thought you were going to ask me is if they're written by amanuenses.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where I thought you were going. Yeah. So a good chunk of them are.
Okay.
And so a lot of them, like you saw, Zana Musen says with Andrew Crofts, Francis Box is with Edward Tibnan. So they have ghostwriters, and those ghostwriters have, I don't know what you call it, I guess an amanuensis, but a ghostwriter that is actually named on the cover. Some of them are not named. Some of them have written them themselves. Rachel Lloyd wrote her book on her own. She like locked herself up. A lot of the narratives that I have in the book are things that people wrote. They're just short pieces, so they're not like book-length narratives, so they're not as, you know, like technically flashy, or, you know, like they're not told with flashbacks the way some of them are. And so they are interestingly structured by what the ghostwriter thinks a slave narrative should look like. And so that kind of messes with my research too. I don't know quite how to say what, like intentionality is a real issue. So it's an interesting question. You have a follow-up.
The last one.
Do it.
Is, so, in Douglas's narrative, right, his moment of misdirection that is most talked about is around Lancaster. And part of the way that we kind of think about that is around the politics of respectability.
Yeah.
I'm really interested to, could you kind of articulate their misdirection as part of their own kind of agency around their narrative? Do you think that that is a current kind of critique of our own respectability politics? And if they feel like they're already kind of using this borrowed time, and so they're wondering about the limitations of empathy, right?
Yeah.
If there's a way that they don't want to do too much, and that in and of itself kind of creates a hierarchy around what's important about, right?
I think that the politics of respectability is actually still quite an important issue. Nobody wants, well, not nobody, right? Some people on Maury Povich want to tell you about their sex lives. Most people aren't going to write about their sex lives even now, and it's not like, you know, quite as puritanical as the kind of things that Linda Brent was, you know, confronting. But most people are not going to expose their sexual life to people on the page and just have that immemorial